much more by changing the heat and exchanging the air in it quite regularly. So you don't want to open the bag very often. You don't want to be moving it inside and out of the fridge or freezer. I find it keeps just as well in the freezer very often either. So that is one thing to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is once you've opened it, you are likely to have a lesser viability rate on your yeast. So I always overpitch. The dead yeast cells that are there are only going to be nutrient anyway. So you can use that extra, you can overpitch if you've got an already open packet of yeast. And this is how I save money as well, in that I buy the 1 pound packets, which is around about 100 times bigger than the little 5 gram sachets. And I know I'm mixing my units, AJ, but you'll just have to deal with it.
That's fine. I'm bilingual.
And yes, they're only about 10 times. You get 100 times the yeast, but they're only about 10 times the price. So you can be a whole lot more cavalier, and you're no longer trying to scrimp, so you don't really worry. So, but that's it's temperature change and air exchange that is your biggest enemy with packaging your own yeast. Back to you, Ryan.
So, and I understand what you're saying, and you buy in those large volumes. I actually buy a lot of my yeast in 80-gram sachet packets, and that's almost perfect for the batches that I pitch. But for the people that are making smaller batches, and that's why I say, just use the whole 5-gram pack and throw it in there. It's not going to, even if you're doing a half a gallon, it's not going to hurt anything. It's going to only be better for you. And why try to save 30 cents? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But
yeah, reusing a 5-gram packet, I don't really understand.
In my case, it's because I want to do another batch shortly, and I've only got the 1 package, and I don't want to have to drive half an hour to the brew store.
I understand.
So, combination of bad planning and laziness. Or, stores closed on Sundays. Now, Dingerth had a question. We were just talking about overpitching. You were saying last week you said to underpitch if you want more esters from your yeast. So if 2 grams per gallon is the standard, how much should you be underpitching by if you're trying to get esters? That's a great question, Dingerth, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know.
It's sort of a suck it and see type thing, I think, Ding. You could go so bad as you get nasty phenols and things being thrown by very stressed yeast, or you might just get some pleasant esters. You really just got to play with it. It's going to be different for every yeast.
I generally like to pick yeast that don't make a lot of esters. Rarely do I find the esters are something I want in my meads. I guess if you're talking a gallon, I don't know if a quarter of a gram would be underpitching. I kind of think it might. Maybe that'd be a good little experiment for you to do for us, and then get back to us on that.
Yeah, pick your yeast and do 3 1-gallon batches at different or more at different pitch rates, and just see what you get. Is really all I can, and then make the notes for that yeast. And then you'll have some idea of what's going to happen.
Yep.
It would also be really good for taste testing and figuring out exactly how the pitch rate affects each yeast.
Yeah.
And again, that's a lot of experimentation, and if you do that, we would all love to hear your results.
Yeah, I want a white paper.
Another thing that you could probably do to try to create some more esters is to not only underpitch, but pitch underneath your suggested temperature range for your particular strain that you're talking about. And as a matter of fact, I actually, by design, I do that. Let's say I have a yeast that I want to run at 62 degrees. I'll actually pitch it in 58 degrees or 56 and let it slowly over a couple days warm up to the 62, and then I'll set it and hold it at 62 for the duration of the ferment, specifically because I want to create a small biomass initially. I don't want to create a great big giant biomass, because I think in doing so up front they tend to get what I call top heavy That's why I don't like. I know a lot of people make great meads using DAP. I quit using DAP about 2.5 years ago when Ferment O came out. One of the things with DAP when you feed it right off the bat is they really start to reproduce like crazy, but they're really not taking the time to get fortified and set up right to be a strong, viable yeast all the way to the end of the fermentation. And so I actually pitch in a colder temperature and then slowly warm it up to the place where I want it to then stay held until the ferment's over. So, you guys have any other things we want to talk about before we move on to our last part, which would be the different phases of the yeast cycle or through our fermentation?
No, I think we're all good.
Okay. So, basically we have 3 different phases during our fermentation. We have what we call the lag phase, then it moves into the growth phase, and then once it's finished with the growth phase, it'll move on into the stationary phase, and then at some point it'll move into, it'll start to decline. I don't know if we really consider that a phase, but that's what happens.
Phase.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that's need to understand is not every yeast in this process are going to all be in the same phase at the same time. Not all yeast are the same. Some of them were born at different times and whatnot, and so none of this is cut and dry that, okay, we are absolutely in the lag phase and nobody's moved into the logarithmic phase yet. That's simply not the case. It's kind of a blend of everything. But in a broad sweeping strokes, the lag phase lasts between 0 to 15 hours after you pitch your yeast. I suggest to not feed your yeast any food during this period of time. Well, and let me back up. And I'm not, when I say this period of time, I'm not talking about hours, but I'm talking about as long as you're not seeing any active fermentation going on, I personally choose to not feed at this point in time. The reason being, we've got bad guys in our must, regardless of how hard and how good we've practiced sanitation. And we don't want to feed those bad guys to help them get started. And they will actually eat a good bit of the food that the strains that we designed, that we want there by design, they're not really eating much at this point in time in the lag phase. They're doing this acclimation thing. We talked about the big change between this, the inside and the outside of the cell wall. They're doing this. They're becoming acclimated. They're getting used to their environment. They're taking on the oxygen from the air, and they're starting to bring on some food, and they're basically, I like to think of it as they're in the locker room before the football game. They're getting dressed. They're putting on all their gear that they need to wear before they go out and go crazy on the field. And so they're uptaking whatever yan is naturally found in the must. You might have, fruits or grape juices or whatnot. So they'll be taking up some yan. They're getting acclimated. They're taking and taking the oxygen that we've put in there with our centered stones, and they're creating their better cell membrane. This will last anywhere from 0 to 15 hours. I have found that if you take a flashlight and shine it on your must, you can actually see the earlier stages of fermentation. You can start to see these little tiny, teeny bubbles, and you can see, I call them pricks, like you're pricking the top of your must with a little tiny needle or something. You can see those tiny little bubbles breaking the surface of the meniscus, the water film on top. That's when I choose to feed the first feeding. If the warmer your must is during this phase, the more cells that it'll create. And the more oxygen that you give them, the more cells they will create. And also at this point in time, there's very little actual formation of any flavor compounds. They call it the lag phase. You could call it the sleeping phase. There's really not much going on. other than your players are in the gym putting on their game face and getting on their spikes and their pads and painting the black gear under their eyes and all of that. They're getting ready for the big game. I have read, but I haven't been able to see this in my personal experience, that what triggers them to move in from the lag phase into the logarithmic phase is once the oxygen is gone. But I want to say I know that can't be totally true, because that would mean that if I continue to feed them oxygen with my stone, they're going to continue to stay in their lag phase, and they don't. At some point, you can't stop them from moving forward. And that's one of the questions I want to ask the scientists. Do these guys have the ability to know how much food is in here, to know how many billions of cells they need to get the food all eaten? I mean, there's got to be...
It's been a long time since I studied how biomass works, but it does reach what we call a critical mass at some point, and I believe that's probably the your end of your lag phase.
Now, the way bacteria do it, and I believe fungus like yeast do it as well, is what they call quorum sensing. So at some point they decide that they have enough nearby, enough of their brethren nearby to completely change the way they're behaving, in which case, bacteria is everywhere, but it's only after a certain amount of bacteria forms that you'll get a film over something, and they change the way they behave to lock in and work together at something. And I believe yeast do the same thing. They're going to keep going until they sense enough of their buddies around them in density that they will then change phase, practically stop producing, because they understand that they've reached a critical mass, as AJ said, and they don't want to, and then they start eating the sugar and moving more into their anaerobic phase.
That's right. So then that brings us to the second phase, which we could easily call the growth phase. Now what happens here is they start to consume the sugar, and they create CO2 and ethanol. This is where you're seeing massive amounts of reproduction. This is also where they're going to eat your simple sugars first, and then move on to the more difficult sugars to synthesize, unless of course you're using a fructophilic yeast, which will start and it'll eat the fructose before the glucose, because it thrives better on the fructose. It's important to understand that in this growth phase, this is where 99% of your flavor is made, folks. And this is actually not that long of a phase either. It might last for 3 or 4 days, probably, before then it starts to transition into the stationary phase. If you're only able to control your temperatures for just a few days for some reason or another, this is where you want to control your temperatures, because this is where they're going to kick all the fusels off and all the sulfur compounds and the esters, if their temperatures are not correct for the particular strain. So pay good attention to this. When they're consuming the sugar, they're creating energy, and if you've got bigger batches, if you're making stuff in, larger than 6-gallon buckets, the temperature inside your bucket will increase during this phase because of the energy that they're creating. And so for you guys that have temperature control, you probably already know this, but once they go into this, you might have to lower your temps if you're using a refrigerator or freezer, because they're creating so much energy. You have to put a colder ambient temperature in there to bring that temperature down, and then once they move out of this growth phase, they're not creating as much heat, and so you might have to then raise your temperatures back up a little bit so that you don't keep them stuck down in a temperature that's too cold and will cause them to get lazy. Worst case scenario, go dormant, and they might also, some of them get kind of grouchy, and they'll start making fusels if they're too cold.
And this brings me back to where I was saying remove the thermostat from your fridge.